If you've ever stayed awake pretending to be asleep, not out of fear, but because opening your eyes would mean having to do something about what was happening, then you'll understand this story in a way that no explanation could ever give you. Not because it's complicated, but because it was built entirely in silence, the kind of silence that knows things. I'm going to tell you about one specific night, about two bodies in the same dark room, each one pretending the other was asleep, and what that silence meant to someone who had spent entire years learning how to be invisible. But for you to understand the weight of that moment, I need to show you everything that came before. The room was almost completely dark. The window let in a thin strip of streetlight, enough for shadows to have shape, not enough for any expression to be readable. I was lying on my side on the mattress on the floor, my back to where he was, arms still, breathing regular, perfect, controlled with a level of effort you only have when you're pretending with your entire body that you're not. I was completely, intensely awake. I heard the door open with the careful silence of someone trying not to make noise. I heard footsteps on the wooden floor. He knew Tiago's house well enough to know where to step without the boards creaking. A backpack zipper, the sound of clothes, someone changing in the dark, trying to be invisible, not knowing I was registering every detail, with the precision of an animal that knows it cannot move. Then he stopped. It wasn't the kind of pause someone makes while searching for something in the dark. It wasn't the kind of pause someone makes when they've forgotten something. It was a pause with intention. It was the specific silence of someone looking at a fixed point. I felt it before I understood. I felt it in the way my entire body became more still, as if stillness were protection. As if I didn't move, the moment would pass without touching me. The weight of that gaze was on my chest, on the rise and fall of my chest. He was looking at my breathing. I controlled my breathing. That required an effort you can't imagine. Each breath had to have the right rhythm. Not too fast, not too slow. Not the rhythm of someone who realized they were being watched. The rhythm of someone asleep. I pretended to sleep with my entire body, while every cell of my nervous system was completely awake. He stood still for too long for it to be accidental. And then, very slowly, he moved. He lay down. He went quiet. The room went back to its earlier silence, but it was a different silence now. It was a silence that knew things. I kept looking at the wall for a long time. On the other side of the room, someone else wasn't sleeping either. But for you to understand what that silence meant, I need to go back to the beginning. I need to show you how two people arrive at a point like that, lying in the same room, awake, aware of each other, saying nothing. Because that point doesn't happen out of nowhere. It's built, brick by brick, glance by glance, silence by silence. Before Raphael existed in my life, I had a version of myself that worked well. Not necessarily a happy version, but an efficient one. I was 19 years old. I'd started an administration program at the Federal University at the beginning of the year, and I already knew how to do the thing I'd learned to do since I was 12. Exist in a way that creates no friction. Our house was a 2-story house in the suburbs of São Paulo. 2 floors, a large living room in front, a kitchen that opened onto the backyard with concrete flooring, and a pipe that always dripped a little in the summer. 3 bedrooms upstairs. It was the kind of house that smelled like coffee at 7 in the morning, and silence from 10 at night onward, when my mother had already gone to bed, and the world outside disappeared. Tiago and I shared the hallway. My mother worked a lot. My father too. It was the kind of house where life happened in noise when Tiago was awake, and in silence when he wasn't. And because Tiago was always the loudest, silence was rare. And when it happened, it was mine. Tiago is 22 years old. He's studying engineering, and he's one of the least guarded people I've ever known. He's not stupid. He simply doesn't organize the world in terms of subtext. For him, things are what they appear to be. Living with him made things simultaneously simple and strange, because I spent my entire existence moving at the level of unsaid things, and he didn't know that level existed. I was the quieter brother, the more responsible one, the one who didn't cause trouble. I didn't choose it, I became it. When you learn early that certain parts of you don't fit in the available space, you fold them. You don't make them disappear. You just fold them carefully and keep them somewhere they won't get in the way. I'd known I was gay since before I had the vocabulary for it. I was thin, had dark hair slightly tousled, brown eyes that registered everything. And I learned early that eyes that register everything need to be managed. It wasn't active suffering. It was more like information I carried with me and managed competently. I'd never told anyone, not exactly out of fear, but because telling required a degree of presence I hadn't yet decided to have. To tell, you need to take up space, and I'd spent years becoming the smallest amount of space possible. College had started 2 months ago. I was adjusting. The classes were good. There were classmates who weren't exactly friends yet, but were the kind of functional relationships that worked while you were still figuring things out. Life was within the parameters I could manage. I was a master at concealing intentions, good enough to ignore the daily cost of that armor. It was on a Tuesday night that the cost changed form. I was in the kitchen, ear to my phone in a call with a classmate about an assignment, staring at nothing, when Tiago appeared. He got water, leaned against the sink, and spoke at the speed of someone thinking out loud. Rafael is coming to São Paulo next weekend. I asked if he wanted to stay here for a few days. I lowered the phone from my ear. Tiago kept talking. "You're going to like him. He's a good guy. We've been studying together for 2 years. I said something in the right tone. That it was fine, of course. The house was big enough. Tiago was already leaving the kitchen. The conversation lasted 40 seconds. The name hung in the air for a few moments after he left. Rafael. A completely ordinary name. I didn't know yet that I would register the moment it was said for the first time, that I would carry the exact memory of the kitchen's fluorescent light and the smell of old coffee as I heard it. But the brain keeps what it will need. Even when you don't yet know, you'll need it. He arrived on a Friday afternoon. I was in my room when I heard the front door. I heard Tiago's voice, loud as always, and I heard another voice quieter, laughing at something Tiago had said on the way. I stayed where I was for a few more minutes. This was how I did things. Let the situation stabilize before entering it. Let the space assume its new temperature before I had to exist within it. When I came down, they were in the living room. Tiago on the couch with his feet on the table, Rafael in one of the armchairs. First impression, he was taller than I expected. 21 years old, lighter hair than mine, the kind of posture of someone comfortable in any space because he'd never had reason not to be. A smile that came easily, the kind of smile that doesn't calculate whether it's the right moment. I looked for long enough to be polite. Said hi. He said hi. Tiago started doing the introduction Tiago always does, with unnecessary details and lots of volume, and I sat in the chair farthest away, with the specific feeling of someone who had identified a risk and was calculating the safe distance. It wasn't a romantic reaction. It was almost the opposite of that. It was the kind of recognition you have when you encounter something that will destabilize the system you've built. Not because it's bad, but because it's the kind of thing the system wasn't designed for. Rafael was the kind of person I'd trained myself not to look at too closely. Not because there was something obvious about him, but because there was something in me, a reaction, a hypervigilance that I recognized and needed to contain before it became visible. I stayed in the room long enough not to seem strange. I participated in some conversations. I answered when asked, smiling at the right times, avoiding the rest. But there was a moment. Tiago was telling some story about a class that had gone wrong, gesticulating, moving through the space the way he does. And in the middle of a pause, Raphael turned to me. Not to the group, to me specifically, in a way that assumed he had paid enough attention to have a specific question. "What do you study?" "Business," I said. "First year." "Ah." He nodded, as if that confirmed something. "You seem calmer than the freshman I know." It was a tiny observation, the kind of thing anyone says without thinking, but he had looked at me in the middle of a conversation that wasn't about me, and had said something that assumed he had paid enough attention to have an impression. I answered with something brief. He laughed. Tiago was already talking about something else. I went to bed earlier that night, as usual. I lay in my room, stared at the ceiling, and did what I always did. Inventoried the risk. I calculated. I concluded I was exaggerating, that it was a weekend. That Raphael would leave on Monday, and I would never have to think about it again. But my instinct for self-preservation had already triggered the opposite alarm. Raphael didn't leave on Monday. He stayed until Wednesday, because of a project he and Tiago needed to finish together. He came back the following weekend, because, as Tiago explained with the naturalness of someone who doesn't realize he's changing the terms of some tacit agreement, it's easier to study here than at his apartment. He came back the next weekend, and the next one. In 6 weeks, Raphael had become a regular presence in the house. He didn't live there. He had an apartment with other students near college, but he would show up and stay. And Tiago was happy when he was there, more animated, louder in a different way, and that was good for the overall dynamic of the house, and I had no reasonable argument against any of it. What I had was a very precise internal map of where Raphael was at any moment in the townhouse. It wasn't something deliberate. It was what my hypervigilance ran on autopilot. I knew when he was in the kitchen by the sound of drawers, knew when he was in the upstairs bathroom by the different footsteps in the hallway, knew when he was leaving because there was a specific pattern of sounds that preceded the front door. I didn't do anything with this information. It was just that it existed, and I knew that it existed, and not talking about it to myself was the maximum control I could manage. There was the night in the kitchen. It was late after 11. I'd gone down for water. The kitchen was lit, and I went in without thinking there might be someone there, because Tiago was already asleep, and I'd figured Raphael was in the guest room. But he was there, his back to me, doing something at the counter. He turned when I came in, said something about not being able to sleep. I said something about being thirsty. The conversation was brief and inconsequential, and neither of us left the space immediately like we should have. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable the way it should have been. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who know each other in a way that wasn't explicitly negotiated, where neither of us needs to fill the void, because the void doesn't weigh. I stayed there about 3 minutes, the ice cube melting in the glass, while I didn't drink the water I'd come down to get. He stayed too. When I said goodbye and went back upstairs, it was with the strange sensation that I'd just passed through something, without being able to say what. There was the remote control. An afternoon, watching television, Tiago, Raphael, and me, in that order on the couch. The heavy heat of March making the ceiling fan spin without conviction. I had the remote. Raphael reached in my direction without looking, in the distracted gesture of someone reaching for something common use, and his fingers passed by mine for a second. Less than a second. The exact duration of a distraction. But my skin registered it. The static from that touch shot up my arm with an irrational force, requiring an immediate lock in my facial muscles to not show the impact. He didn't react. Or if he noticed, he hid it perfectly. Changed the channel, kept watching. I kept my hands still in my lap for the rest of the show. And there was the look. That afternoon in the living room, with Tiago in the middle of a story that took up all the space in the conversation. I looked at Rafael for some reason. A point in what he'd said, something that caught my attention. And when my eyes reached him, he was already looking at me. The problem wasn't that. The problem was that neither of us looked away fast enough for it to be natural. It should have been 2 seconds. But it was 2 seconds in which we both knew we were looking at each other, and we kept looking anyway. And then one of us looked away, and the conversation continued, and Tiago didn't notice anything. But I was left with that. The same way I held on to every piece of this puzzle I was trying not to put together. There's a kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. It's the tiredness of a level of attention you sustain without stopping, of calibrating every expression, monitoring every reaction, making sure nothing leaks. It's efficient as a system, but it has a cost. And it came to a point where I stopped pretending I didn't know what I was feeling. Not for anyone else, just for me. In the silence of my room, on an afternoon when the house was empty, I did what I should have done weeks before. I was honest with myself about what was happening. I was interested in Rafael, not in a passing way, in a way I recognized as dangerous to the careful balance I'd built over years. Just knowing that, clearly without wrapping it in maybe, or the language of exaggeration, was enough to make me go very quiet. But there was a second level to this recognition, because knowing what I felt was one thing. Another thing entirely was what I perceived about him. Rafael asked me questions with a frequency slightly higher than the situation justified. Not to Tiago, to me. Small things. What I thought of a movie. What I specifically studied. Whether I liked a band playing on the radio. The times when Rafael could have stayed in one room and chose the one I was in. The times when I looked and he was already looking. The kitchen late at night, where neither of us needed to have stayed longer than necessary. I saw the pattern. And then, I took inventory of what it was costing me. The energy of faking normalcy when he entered a room. The exhaustion of calibrating every reaction so nothing leaked. The specific strangeness of wanting someone not to be there, while simultaneously counting the hours until they appeared. The work of not looking at his shirt that was left forgotten on the back of the living room chair for 3 days, that I saw every time I passed, and that I pretended I didn't know was his. I was very good at pretending, but with yourself, there's a limit. So, that afternoon with the house empty, I allowed myself to know what I knew, without doing anything with it, just knowing. And it was exactly at that point, the point where I stopped pretending, I didn't know, that the situation decided to complicate itself in a way I couldn't have predicted. That same week, Tiago announced, with the enthusiastic energy of someone who thinks they're giving good news, that Saturday there would be people over at the house. About 8-10 people. It'll be fun. Some were going to sleep over. Rafael was going to stay. The guest room only had one bed. I heard Tiago doing the calculations out loud. Who slept where? Who took the air mattress to the living room? Who stayed on the floor of his room? And I heard, with the part of my brain that was permanently calculating consequences, that the available arrangements placed one specific person on the floor of Tiago's room. That person was me. There was no drama in it. It was simply the most logical solution. Tiago's air mattress was the biggest. The room was the most spacious. I was the quietest, the one who complained the least, the one who needed the fewest specific conditions to sleep. So Tiago said, "You won't mind, right?" And I said no, and that was that. Only Rafael was also going to sleep in that room. Saturday night was big the way Tiago's nights always were. The house filled with overlapping voices, the smell of beer and pizza that arrived around 8. the particular heat of many bodies in a closed space in March. Tiago grew in these moments. More stories, more volume, more movement. I did what I always did in these situations. I was present enough not to seem absent, and I gradually withdrew myself as the night went on. Around 11, most people were already settling in somewhere. Tiago had drunk a little, not much, just enough to fall asleep faster than usual. He went to his room, got the people who were going to sleep in the living room settled, and in 20 minutes, he was snoring with the volume and conviction that only Tiago could manage. I was on the air mattress on the floor of his room. The door was ajar, never fully closed, never fully open, the exact ambiguity of the entire situation represented in wood. The house grew quieter in stages. Around 2 in the morning, it was the kind of silence that only exists at those hours. Dense, with its own texture, the world outside seeming suspended. Raphael had left earlier with some other friends. "We'll be back later, Tiago knows." And I had heard that, calculated what it meant, and then did what I'd learned to do. I turned off the calculation and tried to sleep. I almost managed. I was in that state between waking and sleep, where you know you're almost there, where thoughts start to loosen, where your body weighs differently, when I heard the front door. Footsteps in the hallway. The kind of steps of someone aware that the house is sleeping and trying not to disturb it. The wooden stairs navigated with the care of someone who already knows which ones creak. The bedroom door opened. Slowly. Carefully. I didn't open my eyes. It wasn't exactly a decision. It was a reflex. The same thing that makes me control my expression when I'm feeling something I don't want to show. Closing my eyes was easier than deciding what to do with them open. I heard him enter. I heard footsteps on the floor. I heard Tiago grumble something in his sleep and move, and then silence returned. Then the sounds of someone changing in the dark began. The zipper of a backpack, carefully. The sound of a shirt being removed. The soft rustle of fabric. A belt buckle. Each detail reached me with a clarity that only exists when all the other senses are compensating for the absence of sight. I was lying on my side, my back to the side of the room where he was. Arms still. Regular breathing. Perfect. I was completely awake. There was enough light from the window for shadows to move. Not enough for faces to be legible. The house had that specific silence of the hot March midnights in São Paulo, where the heat of the day still lingers in the bricks, and the night hasn't managed to cool anything down properly. The sounds of changing diminished, and then, without warning, they stopped. It wasn't the silence of having finished changing and going to bed. It was another kind of pause, the kind that has direction, that has an object. I knew the difference before I even understood what I knew. Raphael had stopped moving. The silence had texture now. It had density. It had a point of arrival. I realized it before even formulating the thought. His stillness was directed at me, not in a threatening way. In a way, I had never been looked at before, with a specific attention that wasn't casual curiosity, nor was it anything I had vocabulary to name. It was an attentiveness that landed on me with a care that makes no sense towards someone you believe is sleeping. He was looking at my chest. I knew that without seeing. I knew it by the way the silence was concentrated at that point, at the rise and fall of my breathing. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath to hear mine. I held my breath for a fraction of a second before releasing it very slowly. Sustaining that illusion required an absurd physical discipline. Each cycle of my chest needed to follow a blind, fluid rhythm, without jolts, simulating absolute rest. Meanwhile, beneath my skin, my maximum state of alert screamed in frequencies that left no sonic trace. Raphael stayed still. 5 seconds. 10. More. Too much time to be distraction. Too much time to be a coincidence of looking. Time enough for the only possible justification to be pure intentionality, with full consciousness, with a distinct gravity, even if unpronounceable. I didn't move. I was afraid that if I moved, the moment would break in a way that couldn't be fixed, or that it would break in a way that could be, which was almost more terrifying. Then he moved. Slowly, quietly, he went to where he was going to sleep and lay down. The room fell quiet the way it had been before, but it wasn't. The silence was the same, and it was completely different. It was the silence of a room with two people who know things that went unsaid, who know that the other knows, who know and stay quiet, because a dark room at 3 a.m. is not the place to do anything about it. I kept staring into the darkness on my side of the wall. He kept staring into the darkness on his side. And we both stayed awake for a long time, motionless in the darkness, immersed in a void that said so much more than any words we could have thrown into it. The next morning, Tiago woke up loud. It was inevitable. Tiago always wakes up loud. He asked his mom to make coffee, cursed something about the March heat that didn't respect even weekends, made the kind of noise that fills the whole house before the rest of the person is awake. The room came out of sleep in stages. I was awake long before anyone else, but I pretended to wake up when Tiago turned on the light. Rafael was sitting on the edge of the bed, running his hand over his face. He said something in the tone of someone who had just woken up. Tiago answered. The morning began like every Saturday morning. Coffee, scrambled eggs, the living room TV with some program nobody was really watching. The crowd from the night before was leaving in stages, with the hugs and "we should see each other more often" that accompany the end of every gathering. Everything normal. Except Rafael didn't cross my space at any moment. Not in an abrupt way. It wasn't the kind of thing someone from outside would notice. It was subtle. It was the way of always choosing the other side of the table, of getting coffee after I'd already left the kitchen, of answering when I spoke, but without starting a conversation, without creating an opportunity to be in a smaller space than the entire living room. The distance was calculated, polite, almost imperceptible, but I noticed. And I noticed because I knew the previous pattern. I knew how Rafael moved when he wasn't calculating, how he would appear in the same space, how questions would emerge, how contact wasn't avoided. I knew the difference between his normal presence and that. That was distance with intention. In the following days, Rafael didn't show up. Tiago mentioned once that he was busy with a college project, then mentioned that he had a test coming up, then stopped mentioning it because for Tiago, it was just the natural flow of things. And I did the work I knew how to do. I tried to take apart what had happened within a narrative that fit into a normal life. I tried to convince myself that I had projected weight onto a silence that weighed nothing, that he was staring into the darkness and I was in the way. But there was one thing that didn't fit. Fleeing is different from being busy. Evasion requires total focus on the target, and his strategic absence was the greatest proof that our night had left an obvious trace that neither of us knew how to erase. That both reassured me and disturbed me in equal measure. 3 weeks later, Tiago arrived on a Friday night and Rafael was with him. It was total naturalness. Backpack thrown on the couch, some joke from the way there, Tiago shouting if there was food. Rafael was smiling. Nothing in his behavior suggested there had been 3 weeks of calculated distance before that moment. I was in the kitchen when they arrived. I said hi to Tiago. I said hi to Rafael. Rafael said hi back, with the natural tone of someone who says hi to people. The night began. I did what I always did. I was present in the right measure, withdrew when it was possible to do so, without drawing attention. Tiago turned on the video game. Rafael stayed watching, commenting, drinking beer. The house had its normal noise. It was on Saturday afternoon that the balance cracked. Tiago had something to take care of quickly. He left without giving much detail. Something with a college classmate. Something that would take an hour at most. "You guys are good there, right?" And he left. I was on the couch. Rafael was in the armchair. He had placed his phone on the coffee table, face down, right when Tiago left. The almost automatic gesture of someone who decided that this moment wouldn't be interrupted, with nothing explicit to justify that decision. The TV was on some random channel that neither of us was really watching. The emptiness that took over the room as soon as the door closed carried a new electricity. Rafael spoke first. He commented on something about the program on screen. I answered in the right tone. He continued. The conversation went on, superficial, within the territory we both knew how to navigate. And then it slipped. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of growing tension or a long pause before the question. It was the conversation going somewhere that, later, became clear that neither of us had planned to go. We were talking about something about his college, about a group dynamic in a project, about how people were in contexts different from what they appeared to be. And in the middle of that, in a way that didn't exactly connect with the thread of the conversation, Rafael asked, "Do you have someone?" I went quiet for a second. Not because the question was impossible. It was a normal question. But it came at a moment that wasn't for normal questions, in a way that presupposed a specific attention. The attention of someone who thought about it before asking. The question had a context that wasn't the context of the conversation. He noticed that I had noticed. I saw that in the instant it happened. A small change in his expression, the minimal movement of someone who misjudged the terrain and is recalibrating. "Sorry," he said. "You didn't have to." "No." I spoke without thinking. "It's fine." And then the conversation stopped. Not with tension, with the kind of pause that happens when something has been said and the air is still processing it. The TV continued. Some host was talking about something. Rafael's phone remained on the table, face down. When Tiago came back, we were both sitting in silence. He didn't notice anything. He interpreted it as two guys watching TV in peace. He sat down between us, demanded attention with his usual noise, and the night went on. But the question stayed. It stayed through that whole week. It stayed while I went to college, while I came back, while I passed by his shirt that had made its way back to the armrest of the living room chair. It stayed in the way I thought about it late at night and couldn't reach a satisfying conclusion. What was he about to ask? Why did he stop? And why that specific question, at that specific moment, in a way that sounds like someone who'd thought about it before? 10 days later, Tiago went out with the other friends on a Thursday. It wasn't unusual. Tiago had an abundant social life. He had invited us, but Rafael had said he was tired, that he was staying. And I hadn't gone either for reasons that seemed reasonable. There was an exam the following week. I had material to study. Reasons that were true, and also something else. And then it was 10 at night. Tiago was out, and Rafael and I were in the living room. The TV, again. Safe distance. Comments about nothing. But Rafael was different. Not in a way that any outsider would notice. It was that quality I had learned to identify in him. The moments when something beneath the surface was less calculated. When he became less careful about the space he occupied in conversation, as if the energy that normally went into maintaining his facade was being used for something else. We kept watching for a while longer. Some movie neither of us was actually watching. And then he turned off the TV. He didn't say anything for a moment. The room filled with the ambient silence of the street, the houses around us, the heat still lingering in the air despite it being night. He was looking straight ahead. I was looking at him. Can I ask you something? Yeah, I said. That night. He paused. Started again. In Tiago's room. The atmosphere grew heavy. Not with a sudden rupture, but in the dense way that happens when two people realize simultaneously that they've crossed an invisible boundary. Were you asleep? The question hung in the air for a moment that felt much longer than real time. I had a prepared answer. I had several. Versions of yes, versions of probably, versions of asking what exactly he meant. Versions that kept me in the safe territory of the unsaid, the ambiguous, the manageable. I chose none of them. No, I said. Raphael went quiet. It wasn't the silence of embarrassment. It was the silence of someone hearing an answer they already knew, but needed to hear out loud. It was the silence of someone who asked a question because they needed the confirmation, not because they didn't know. Okay, he said, very quietly. We were quiet for a moment. The street made its noise outside. A car passing. A neighbor's dog. Why did you keep looking? I asked. I hadn't planned to ask. The question came from the same place the no had, from the space where I had stopped managing. Raphael breathed. I don't know how to answer that in a way that makes sense. Try. He was quiet for a while longer, eyes still looking straight ahead. Then, with the voice of someone saying something they hadn't rehearsed. Because I wanted to. Pause. Because I can't help but want to, when you're near. The room had a different temperature than before. I looked at him. There was a different kind of tension in his body. Not defense, not withdrawal. Something more like the quality of someone who had set down something heavy and didn't yet know if they could stand without it. I'm gay, I said. I hadn't planned to say that in the quiet of that Thursday. Or maybe the decision had always been there, throbbing beneath my armor. Maybe it was the gear that the night in the room had activated, that Saturday's question had unlocked, and that the recent distance had been ripening. It was a short sentence, sharp, delivered in a low voice in the middle of a quiet room. But it was the first time in my life I let those words come out. Raphael held my gaze. For an endless instant, he simply took me in. I know, he said. And there was a gentleness in that phrase that wasn't condescension. It was recognition. It was the specific quality of someone you realize has been truly seeing you, in a way you hadn't consciously given permission for, but that happened anyway. And you? I asked. Raphael ran his hand over his face, breathed with the slowness of someone gathering words from a territory that has no map. I don't know, he said finally. I don't know what I am. I know that the way I feel next to you isn't the same as how I feel next to anyone else. Pause. And I know that matters, even if I don't know what it means yet. It wasn't a mirrored confession. It wasn't a complete arc. It was a 21-year-old boy saying the most honest thing he could say about himself in a moment he hadn't asked for. And there was more respect in that than in any neat, tidy declaration he could have made. The conversation didn't resolve everything, and it wasn't supposed to. What she did was materialize what surrounded us, and exposing things to the light has a very different impact than insisting on blindness. A dense impact, yes, but a true one. It's something you come to carry with a different posture. We stayed a while longer in the room. We talked about other things, eventually. Small things. The conversation returning to the surface slowly, like something emerging from water. When Tiago arrived, an hour later, the room was the room it always was, and we were the people we always were. But we weren't. There are things that change the magnetic field of a space simply by being said, and this was one of them. In the days that followed, the house had a different quality. Not in a visible sense, Tiago didn't notice anything. The routine continued with its normal noise and rhythm. But there was a difference that only I would know how to identify. Rafael was no longer managing the distance between us with the same care as before. There were no emotional speeches or exaggerated promises. Our dynamic didn't turn into an indie film overnight. What settled in was just the frank texture of a closeness that no longer had to apologize for existing. He would ask me things with the naturalness of before, about college, about what I thought, about small details that someone only asks about when they want to know the answer. Not in a way that Tiago would notice, but in a way that I noticed. One afternoon, in the kitchen, the two of us alone while Tiago was in the bathroom, he simply stayed. Didn't say anything. Neither did I. And the silence between us had the quality of that first time late at night. Not uncomfortable, not heavy. The silence of two people who know something together and don't need to turn it into noise. The forgotten t-shirt came back to rest on the back of the living room chair a week later, as if it were the most natural thing. And this time, when I passed by it, I didn't look away. I just looked. It's a t-shirt. It's his. I know it is. And that doesn't need to cost anything. That was the smallest and most enormous change that happened. I stopped managing my own eyes. I don't know what Rafael will discover about himself over time. What paths he'll walk. What truths he'll have to name or not name. This story doesn't have an answer for that. And it honors that uncertainty instead of trying to resolve it. What exists is a recognition that happened, and two guys who stopped pretending that certain things didn't exist. On an ordinary morning in April, the house had its usual noise. My mother preparing coffee before leaving for work. Tiago coming down the stairs with the specific impact of someone who's always in a rush. Something on the living room TV. I was in the kitchen, having coffee, looking out the window to the yard. The sun coming in at a morning angle, hitting the concrete outside, creating those long shadows that only exist at this time of day and only last a few minutes before they shorten. I wasn't managing anything. There was no calculation happening, no monitoring of reactions, no inventory of risk, no calibrating how much of myself could show and how much needed to remain folded in a drawer. I was just there, with the coffee warming my hand, with the sound of the house around me, with the morning happening around me. It was a completely undramatic scene. Caio, 19 years old, freshman in business administration, the quieter brother, was in a kitchen on a Sunday morning, breathing deeply and free, without needing to disguise his own existence. That, for me, was the beginning of something. And it was enough. If you've also stayed awake pretending to be asleep, if you know that sensation of holding your breath so no one notices that you're awake to more than you can admit, then you understood this story from the inside. Stay here. We're going to keep telling stories like this one. Give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Every new story we tell begins with you.